Shadowkeep was a bit of a letdown expansion, but hopefully the seasons this year could make up for what lacked during the Shadowkeep launch and Season of Undying. And first up to bat would be Season of Dawn, a season focused around the legendary character Saint 14 from the lore. Osiris had resurrected him with the use of his sundial time machine, and our job was to help both Osiris and Saint 14 stop the Red Legion from changing history by using Osiris's sundial. The activity for the event was called, you guessed it, the sundial, and it continued to be another run-of-the-mill horde mode, throwing balls, clearing ads in various rooms, and fighting a boss. Something that still had yet to be nearly as fun as the menagerie. Although this season did include multiple bosses that would rotate weekly, as well as a legendary difficulty, so it was absolutely a step up from the Vex offensive in Season of Undying. And the final boss of the season in the Sundial was so much better than the Undying Mind, if only for the unique arena that you fought him in. Obelisks were how you ranked up most of the seasonal content and were the first real introduction of one of these kind of overly confusing and complex mechanisms in the game. I know most of us are used to how these things work nowadays, as they're all pretty similar, but in Season of Dawn, everyone was just annoyed and kind of confused. But once players got the hang of it, it caught on a bit and players grew to enjoy it to a degree. And like I mentioned, similar iterations of this mechanism would become the norm for every season going forward. One of the frustrations with the obelisks came from the Dawn mods only being able to be applied to Season of Dawn armor, meaning you'd have to grind for new armor with better rolls in order to use them. This meant that a soft form of sunsetting would kind of be introduced, which was frustrating. After only 3 months of grinding all of our new Armor 2.0 stuff in the previous season, now none of it was useful, to the fullest at least, for this season. Like, yes, you could use it, but of course players want to try out the new seasonal charged with light mods, and you had to do that with Dawn-only armor. This was definitely not a popular decision to introduce this soft sunsetting so soon. However, partway through the season, this would be changed to allow Dawn mods on the last 3 seasons of armor. The seasonal story missions with Saint 14 were the real highlight though. Saint 14 became an instantly lovable character for fans, and his dialogue with Osiris and Shaxx were a real pleasure to listen to. The gameplay of his missions were definitely some of the best we've ever had in any season. 3 exotic weapons were added during Season of Dawn, and 3 exotic armor pieces. The first was Symmetry, the Season Pass weapon, which was a unique and fun exotic scout rifle. The second weapon was the Devil's Ruin sidearm, which had players travel back to Twilight Gap, where we had some great lore and dialogue between Saint 14, Shaxx, and Osiris. But that was kind of it for the exotic quest, unfortunately. And the weapon itself was a bit situational, but unique for sure. Not great, not terrible. And the third weapon was Bastion, which is a slug fusion rifle that takes some inspiration from Pocket Infinity, I imagine, with its design. But the most important thing about this weapon was its exotic quest, the Corridors of Time puzzle, which was very similar to the Niobe Labs quest back in Black Armory. It was a bit of a community-driven event. It took 6 days to finally unravel this mystery after many clues and possible theories were posted online, and after finally completing the puzzle, that wouldn't be all for the quest. Unfortunately, players learned that they would need to then grind out some very tedious quest lines from the Spider, meaning things like public events, lost sectors, bounties, and then wrapping up with a unique version of the Hollowed Layer Strike, which would finally bag players the Bastion weapon. It was a really unique and difficult puzzle, but the busy work after the fact kind of led it to ending on a sour note. But players did hope to see more puzzle-like quests in the future. The armor pieces added were Prometheum Spur for the Warlocks, Bombardiers for the Hunter, and Severance Enclosure for the Titans. The ritual weapons for Season of Dawn were the Komodo Linear Fusion from Crucible, the Python Shotgun from Gambit, and the Buzzard Sidearm from the Vanguard. All of these weapons were pretty decent, above average in most cases, but still couldn't touch the power of the pinnacle weapons during Forsaken. And the send-off to Season of Dawn content was the Empyrean Foundation community event, which required players to donate polarized fractaline, billions of it across all players, and doing so would unlock the Trials of Osiris game mode that would be coming next season. But let's be honest, Trials would be coming back regardless of whether or not we completed the event. One of the best ways to farm weapons would be a side effect of this event. When you turned in Fractaline, it would complete bounties that rewarded you with seasonal weapons that you could purchase multiples of in order to just cash them in over and over again, thus farming for god rolls in the least exciting way, endlessly cashing bounties. But that pretty much sums up this event. The Dawning would make a return during this season, bringing essentially the same content as it did during Forsaken's year, baking cookies and all that. This time, however, you could earn a new SMG. the Cold Front, which was a 750 RPM. It could be nice with a decent roll, but not amazing by any standards. Thankfully, you could still earn the new Avalanche machine gun from last year, which was one of the better machine guns in the game. A couple months later, we saw Crimson Days make its final return, as the event would be discontinued after this year in 2020. The event lasted a week as usual and brought a couple new exotic sparrows, but that was about it. Now, Season of Dawn wasn't a bad season, but mainly because the story was so interesting and full of some great characters that helped add to the existing lore, and a few of the weapons during the season were actually pretty good, and the gameplay for the season was still lacking a bit, but definitely not the worst seasonal activity content. But coming in March was the next season of Destiny 2, Season of the Worthy. The hype levels were pretty high for this one, mainly because of one thing. Trials of Osiris would finally be returning after being left behind in Destiny 1, and after Trials of the Nine had been on hiatus for over a year and a half, it was very exciting to get a Trials mode back in the game. And Trials was definitely the main draw for the season. The seasonal story and seasonal activity content definitely wasn't turning any heads, however. Another Cabal Red Legion themed story which was getting tired at this point. The thing about these two seasons released during Shadowkeep's year were that they felt like a continuation of the original DLCs from year 1. Season of Dawn was a continuation of Curse of Osiris' storyline to a degree, and a much improved one at that, and Season of the Worthy was shaping up to be a continuation of the Warmind DLC with Anna Bray at the helm of this storyline, along with Rasputin. Now on some level this is pretty cool, right? To see Bungie actually continuing narrative threads that had come before. It worked out pretty well in Season of Dawn, but could it work in Season of the Worthy? Well, when it launched, Season of the Worthy definitely felt disappointing in regards to the story, likely due to the fact that Warmind from a narrative perspective was awful, and the Red War storyline seemed pretty wrapped up to this point. Not the Cabal narrative as a whole, but the Gaul-led Red Legion stuff. And as such, Season of the Worthy did not bring much interest to the story, at least initially. As for the gameplay loop and seasonal content, it involved upgrading Rasputin bunkers around the different planets in pretty much the same way you upgraded the Season of Dawn obelisks. And clearing out those bunkers is how you could upgrade those said bunkers, along with a bunch of Rasputin bounties, which were pretty bog standard. Seraph Towers were the public event style horde mode that had us just clearing mobs and, you guessed it, throwing balls at something. A mechanic that at this point just felt like it needs to go away. The loot for doing said activities was also pretty unexciting. Except for maybe the 7th Seraph shotgun, there wasn't much that stood out. Although a few old faction weapons were re-added to the game with random rolls, and there were some new armor sets that were, I guess, completely subjective to your taste. But the most notable thing in regards to loot were the mods. Warmind cell mods, which paired with the seasonal weapons to create these little explosive Warmind cells that were very strong for numerous reasons. Legendary Lost Sectors were added to the game and also contributed to ranking up Rasputin bunkers, and were much more difficult than regular Lost Sectors and added champions to them. Grandmaster Nightfalls were introduced to the game and released to very little fanfare initially, mainly because they did not incentivize replayability. They were treated as a one and done kind of activity where you weren't rewarded extra based on your score or how many champions you killed. Loot was the same as Master difficulty, just with a higher drop chance. Gameplay wise though, it wasn't too bad. It was much harder having to navigate things like revive tokens and dealing with the contest modifier which was there at the time. But besides the Conqueror title, there was almost no reason to run them in comparison to just running a Master Nightfall. Luke Smith had made a comment regarding core activities prior to Season of the Worthy, saying that they will be a focus moving forward. However, his comment fell a bit flat when Season of the Worthy would be the first season to remove one of the main reasons to play core activity content: ritual weapons. Prior to Season of the Worthy, 3 separate legendary weapons could be obtained in each activity in all previous seasons. And for now, those were gone, except for one ritual weapon of sorts, I guess, for Iron Banner. This was done because, as DMG would claim in a Reddit post, that ritual weapons couldn't be added because their resources were stretched too thin and didn't have the manpower to create 3 weapons for core activities. Instead, those resources were spent on making old Trials weapons. And the only thing that leads me to believe this not enough resources comment is a bit weak is Eververse saw one of the biggest refreshes to its loot than we'd ever seen before. Season of the Worthy had more cosmetics and vanity items than previous seasons, filled with tons of weapons and armor ornaments. So it's clear they had resources, but instead of allocating them to in-game rewards and activities, they instead opted to just focus on Eververse items. Worthy added 2 exotic weapons and 3 exotic armor pieces. Tommy's Matchbook, the Season Pass exotic, and the Fourth Horseman, which the quest boiled down to run public events for a few hours basically. Very riveting quest. The exotic armor pieces were Citan's Ramparts for the Titan, Raiju's Harness for the Hunter, and Felwinter's Helm for the Warlock. But now it's on to the biggest reason why this season was so hyped up: the return of Trials of Osiris.
These comments did not age well.
Trials is back, and it's pretty insane.
Super!
When we knew that Trials was coming back, the most important thing from us was to do it right.
We want to make sure that we really stick the landing with Trials. It's important that this doesn't go out half-baked.
It's just so cool to have like a pinnacle PvP activity return.
We're hearing it from the players, we feel it ourselves, and I can't wait to bring back a version of Trials that matches what we remember from back in Destiny 1.
Would it live up to expectations? Would it live up to Destiny 1 Trials? Would it even be an activity worth spending your time in? The answer to those questions is no, no, and no. Trials of Osiris Return was something long awaited for the community and PvP fans, and despite saying they didn't want it to release half-baked, they released Trials without ever letting it touch the oven.
This is something that people have been waiting over a year for. I can't tell you how many folks have been so hyped about Trials returning, and for it to return this way, this shit sucks. I'm not gonna lie, fellas, it sucks. Say what you want to say. Not saying the weapons aren't good, but there needs to be an incentive for going flawless.
No adept weapons for flawless, a staple of the original Trials in D1, and the reason to work hard enough for the flawless. All loot was reskinned from Destiny 1. Yes, I know, Bungie has gone on record saying it's not as easy as copy and paste, but the designs were already there. They just had to rebuild them. I'm not saying that was easy, I'm just saying we didn't get anything new. All the armor and weapons from year 1 of Destiny 1, and not even all of the weapons made a return, leaving out things like the Jewel of Osiris. They messed up the scorecard system, so that it incentivized things like resetting your card after 3 wins in order to farm the weapon that week. Card win count based matchmaking on top of the skill based matchmaking made the experience sweatier than ever before and laggier than ever before. Many glitches and bugs like the one that caused a win to count as a loss, and a lot of error codes kicking people from games and couldn't reconnect. And the anti-cheat system did almost nothing to counteract the numerous amounts of cheaters that plagued the entire experience for many players. And since this was just a return of pretty much Destiny 1 Trials content, weapons, armor, maps, all that stuff, and the game mode itself, they should have gone ahead and implemented the good things from Destiny 1.
It's been a year and a half since Trials was in the game. I would have thought throughout that entire amount of time, this game mode would have went further than what it was back inside of Destiny 1, or just stayed the same, or just came back exactly how it was with adept weapons. This system does not make sense to me. It does not incentivize players to invest in this playlist outside of just getting the armor sets and the weapons on rotation. Once you got them, that's it.
Things like adept weapons should have returned to incentivize flawless. The passage coin and D1 style card system should have been in place rather than this unneeded revamp that brought out loop breaking issues like resetting your cards. Trials of Osiris bounties that rewarded you for your time spent in the activity, which was so good in Destiny 1. And on top of that, even smaller things like bringing back some of the staple Trials shaders at the very least, instead of making shaders for Eververse. And lastly, a functional anti-cheat system. They should have seen this coming. Players that would cheat in Trials. But alas, Bungie fumbled at the 1 yard line with D2 Trials, and even now hasn't fully recovered from the flop of its less than half-baked return. By the end of Season of the Worthy, the story had picked up a bit more, no longer being about the Red Legion and the Almighty, and more about using Rasputin to help us fight against the imminent threat of darkness. Fight off the pyramid ships if possible. And the season ended with a live event that had Guardians gather at the tower to watch Rasputin shoot down the Almighty ship, which was really cool, but was a bit soured by the fact that the event had us standing in the tower for over an hour and a half, watching the event unfold very, very slowly. As cool of a spectacle as this was, it just dragged on a little too long. What else was a bit disappointing about the finale was there was nothing after the Almighty crash landed into Earth. No teaser about what this meant for the future of the game. We couldn't travel to the Almighty and inspect or look around. It was a bit of a deflating end to the event. However, it was pretty fun to hang out in the tower and watch the event unfold with a bunch of Guardians, like we were all gathered around for a fireworks show or something. Really cool idea, but not executed ideally. While that's all the main content contained in Season of the Worthy, the season was not over, and we'd see 2 more events take place. First up was Guardian Games, a new event to the game which was very similar to faction rallies, but instead of factions, it was between Guardian classes. The event didn't really add anything new in terms of gameplay content. You needed to earn medals and laurels to turn into your class's podium at the tower, and how could you earn those medals? By doing bounties. An already very bounty-heavy season with an event that focused on just doing bounties. I'm unsure why Guardian Games was added in lieu of the Revelry from Forsaken's year, but my guess is that it's due to the Revelry kind of being a pretty unbalanced and ability spam event, but Guardian Games was a very weak event during an already very weak season, and Heir Apparent, the exotic machine gun, was the only real draw to the event. The final event that took place in Season of the Worthy was the community event called The Lie. The quest took players to Vostok to investigate some things, get a bit of lore and dialogue, and then began the real event that progressed across all Guardians. Players would need to complete 9 million, yes, 9 million Seraph Tower events on each of the planets, 3 million per destination. Each person completing it would count as 1 out of the 9 million, so a fire team of 4 players completing the event would be 4 out of 9 million, for example. After the first day of the event, the EDZ was at 2%, the moon was at 1%, and IO was at 0%. And based on calculations done by the community on Reddit and Twitter, that meant that with progress rates at that level, the community would not finish this event until after Season of the Worthy ended. Season of the Worthy was not a popular season, and the community had already declared this season one of the worst the game had ever seen. So instead of participating in this extremely long and tedious quest, players just opted to protest the event, refusing to even participate in it. After hearing this negative feedback to the event, Bungie would address complaints by providing a 5 times bonus to completions, dropping the total number of required completions from 9 million down to roughly 1.8 million, and increased percentage points per wave completion. They would even increase the bonus to 10 times during weekends. As a result, the event would be completed after 3 days of grinding, rather than the original 3 weeks it was projected to take. Now you know you messed up big time with a community event when after 1 day players just refuse to interact with it, based on how tedious and boring it is. I mean, it's not like the event had us doing anything new. It had us grinding the same exact public event we'd all been grinding for a few months at this point. Most players were over it, and they definitely let Bungie know how they felt about the event. But after completing the community portion of the event, you still weren't done. Now it was time to grind 1,000 shotgun kills. After that snooze fest, it was on to the next step, the Tyrant mission on the moon. Could this be another Whisper of the Worm or Outbreak Perfected style mission? Unfortunately, upon loading up the mission, players were just teleported back to Eris Morn on the moon. Now this was a bug that wouldn't be patched for a few days, and is pretty hilarious. Bungie really just could not get things together for this event. And when we finally did get to play the mission a few days later, it wasn't something like the Whisper or Outbreak mission. It was just another dialogue mission that had us going through an old bunker, listening to Anna Bray, and looking at holograms. And at the end, we'd collect Felwinter's Lie, a Destiny 1 shotgun. The Lie community event would go down as one of the all-time worst events in Destiny history and one of the biggest flounders on Bungie's end. A disappointing, bug-filled, and boring mess. The lore and story was neat, but completely soured by the state of the game at this point, and how the event played out in general. As a whole, Season of the Worthy was awful. The seasonal content was boring and lacked incentives. Trials of Osiris was butchered and delivered in an incomplete, buggy state. Loot was very lacking as well, with only one interesting thing in that regard being Warmind cells, and the story still felt like it was kind of going nowhere. It rightfully earned its name given by the community, Season of the Worthless. But in June we'd be getting the final season that would be releasing before the next expansion. Season of Arrivals. The pyramid ships are here, Savathun has began her plan, and there would be mysteries to uncover with the help of Eris Morn. The story finally was picking up the thread that began with Shadowkeep, the pyramid's arrival to our solar system. Rasputin has gone dark since the first pyramid ship has arrived on Io, and we're tasked to explore Io by Zavala in order to find Eris Morn, who has gone missing. This leads us into the cradle, which has a tree of silver wings, a mysterious paracausal sponge-like entity that absorbs power from the darkness and allows us to communicate with it. which we would do later during the story missions that take place in a throne world in a place called the Court of Savathun, which allows us to communicate with some of our enemies like Nokris. The Tree of Silver Wings was badass, and the story in Season of Arrivals is one of the best seasonal storylines we've ever received. It had real consequences to the overarching plot in a major way. Sure, the last 2 seasons likely did as well, but to figure that out you had to read a lot of the lore. This season, however, we'd see it firsthand in the gameplay and the mission design. The seasonal activity this time wasn't all that exciting, however. It was essentially Gambit meets Escalation Protocol, and it was definitely a lot better than Seraph Towers last season, but still nowhere near as good as Escalation Protocol. But what made it definitely worth running was the brand new Umbral Engram system, which allowed players to focus certain types of loot when turning them in at the new Umbral decoder. Focusing engrams for loot that was actually really good too. The weapons for this season were great, especially the swords, which were modified legendary versions of the Destiny 1 exotic swords, Boltcaster and Darkdrinker, which quickly became staple weapons for the season. But the biggest highlight of this season was probably the brand new dungeon that would be released completely free whether you purchased the season or not. It was likely made free in response to the apathy players felt toward the state of the game and how poorly Season of the Worthy turned out. Bungie would even make the decision to remove this season's Eververse armor from the store and instead use it as reward loot from the new dungeon. A very good decision that added tons of replayability to the new dungeon, as there was now 2 separate armor sets and weapons to chase within it. The Prophecy dungeon would be one of the more unique areas in the game and dealt with lore relating to the Nine. It was by far the best dungeon we'd seen up to this point. Multiple challenging boss fights, an epic Sparrow section, great art direction, and again some really good loot. Arrivals brought 3 new exotic weapons, but not any exotic armor pieces, which would be a first as far as seasons go. The first weapon, Witherhoard, was the Season Pass exotic, and it instantly became a favorite amongst players and completely broke the game with certain raid bosses.
Who hit it?
Oh!
Somebody hit it. Somebody hit it.
Please, 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 please.
Please.
Let's go!
Traveler's Chosen had another busy work questline that also rewarded you with various Nightfall weapons like DFA and Silicone Aroma, and the weapon was fine for niche builds, but nothing special. And lastly, the Ruinous Effigy Trace Rifle, which had a much better quest that required some fragment hunting, killing new secret named enemies in patrol. However, it did kinda end on some busy work just getting void kills. But the weapon itself was very unique and had some great utility. It wasn't making any S tier ranking lists, but it was one of the best trace rifles in the game at the time. Ritual weapons still did not make a return, disappointing but not totally unexpected. Skill-based matchmaking would be removed from the casual Crucible playlists, finally, and breathed a bit of life back into PvP. Not anything substantial at least, I mean there was no new content for PvP this season, but as many players can tell you, the removal of SBMM felt amazing and made players want to actually interact with the Crucible again. However, Trials of Osiris would still be broken during this season at launch, and even more so because players who would earn Flawless would be locked out of the Lighthouse for some reason, until it was fixed a bit later. It was hilariously bad optics for a game mode that was pretty much already dead after its return. About a month after Arrivals launched, Moments of Triumph began, which was one of the game's best. At this point in Destiny 2, there was so much content to play. Raids, dungeons, strikes, destinations, and Moments of Triumph highlighted them in the best way. In the case of raids, we'd see uncapped raid rewards for the duration of the event, meaning that all 5 raids in the game could be farmed endlessly for unlimited rewards, including the chances at exotics. And on top of that, there were quite a few neat cosmetics added to the loot pool of those raids as well, like ghost shells, shaders, and emotes. Moments of Triumph felt a bit like the Age of Triumph during Destiny 1's 3rd year. That was the final send-off to that game. And while this Moments of Triumph did not bring nearly as much as Age of Triumph in Destiny 1, it did have a very similar attitude and way it went about celebrating the old content as AOT. Another month later, we'd get Solstice of Heroes, which brought back the European aerial zone from last year with some new armor sets and vanity items, which could be purchased for Bright Dust. Despite much of the core issues still being present in the game and the lack of things like rituals, exotic armor, no real vendor refresh, bugs here and there, Season of Arrivals as a whole still managed to be going really well so far thanks to the new Umbral Engram system, the story missions, the loot, SBMM removed, and the dungeon. And with the following 2 events that really highlighted the positive aspects of the game. I think Arrivals really shows how a good season with worthwhile content and loot to chase can make the whole game feel good. It encouraged players to engage with its content, both the content that was released during the season and all of the old content, because of how well done the systems were and how worthwhile the loot was to chase in all activities. Now originally the season was going to end in September as we were supposed to get a new fall expansion on the 22nd, but shortly after its reveal it would end up being delayed into November, meaning that we'd get one final event before its release. Festival of the Lost. This meant that this would be the second Festival of the Lost during the Shadowkeep year and would bring back the Haunted Forest for the final time. It made some odd changes to loot and progression that ended up being a bit broken, and kind of like the Trials card, resetting only after a few branches was the new method of farming loot rather than trying to achieve as many branches as possible. It was an unfortunate change to the event that kind of soured the final year with the Haunted Forest. But because of numerous quality of life changes, the game was in a pretty decent state with Arrivals, needing only a few tweaks and changes to the core game. There was a lot to do in the game, and there were some good reasons to do most of the content, but we were only 1 month away from the next expansion, Beyond Light, and massive changes were coming to Destiny 2. Would it be everything we hoped for?